My colleague Andrew has asked me to say a little bit about the future of international order for the end of your course lecture on this theme. Well, I want to say specifically something about the future of the liberal international order, and let me just back up by saying that international order has not always historically been of a liberal kind, but I think we could argue convincingly, as John Ikenberry does, that since 1945 there's really been two key drivers of the liberal order. The first driver, I think, is American hegemony. So, really and truly, you had the harnessing of the liberal ideal in global politics with the one superpower in the world, who, of course, had contestation during the Cold War, but after 1990 it became self-evidently the case that liberalism had triumphed, and the United States was the sole surviving superpower. So, effectively, the relationship between power and ideas was really brought together and unified with the idea of American hegemony. So if that was one key driver that made the post-1945 order a liberal order, the second key driver, I think, is the notion of human rights. And increasingly from the 1945 period, but particularly after the 1970s, you found many states, many Western states in particular, not just pursuing a normal foreign policy, i.e. the pursuit of their interests. You saw Western states wanting to pursue a very values-led direction in their foreign policy. And those values are neatly summed up with the idea of human rights. So there were beliefs that individuals had the right to trade, of course, which is where the notions of free trade come from. But critically also, individuals had the right to security, and they had also had the right to publicly express their views through the fundamental rights and freedoms associated with a liberal order. So really the human rights agenda and American hegemony, I think, were the two reasons why the post-1945 order had a particular liberal character. Now the question now becomes, which is really something that John Ikenberry has asked, is that liberal order in trouble? Well, I think there are reasons to be ambivalent, really, which is kind of a liberal thing in itself, but there are reasons for saying, yes, the order is in trouble, and I think there are also reasons for saying, actually, there's some resilience in that liberal order. So let's take each of those points in turn. Why might that order be in trouble? First, of course, the decline of American hegemony. So if our analysis is right, that the post-1945 order was, in a sense, driven by a liberal American imperial project, then of course the decline of that liberal project means, in some ways, that the harnessing of power and ideas is starting to come unstuck. So that's one reason why we might think liberalism is in trouble. The second reason, and I think we can see this in many places, I think we can see a strong backlash against liberalism from a variety of different sources. Of course, we see it from countries like Russia and China, and I'll come to that in a moment. But we also see a challenge to liberalism from many countries and peoples in the global south that think that the liberal order is really an excuse, or what you might describe as a Trojan horse, for the export of a certain kind of model of governance around the world. And the export is a liberal constitutional model with open trading and so on, which tends to support the interests of the powerful countries in the world. So there's a view very much that Mark Mazower and lots of leading world historians are currently arguing, in the sense that the driver of governance in the global order is, in a sense, another chapter in a very long history of imperial kind of domination. This is something that I'm sure John Louis and Andrew might also address in their talk. So let me just recap then. So liberalism might be in trouble because of the decline of American hegemony. Liberalism is also in decline possibly because of the challenging emerging great powers like Russia, China, India, for example, and possibly Brazil. Many of those countries are not necessarily completely illiberal, but they don't buy the argument, really, that every country needs to be set up along the model of the liberal democratic countries of Western Europe and, of course, the liberal democratic countries of North America, particularly the United States, or even Australia for that matter. So there's a real pushback against the bigger idea, the large L liberal idea, I think, is in serious trouble, and those rising powers are part of the agenda. But I think another part of the agenda is just a growing weariness on the part of the global south about the whole liberal kind of foreign policy agenda. They see themselves constantly scrutinized, constantly criticized by Western liberal powers, and yet they don't think Western liberal powers are doing such a great job themselves in terms of security, in terms of prosperity, and so on. So there's a considerable backlash, I think, in the international system. We very much saw this over Libya. Just as one kind of small example of responsibility to protect, which is a big part of what I do here at University of Queensland, we really saw an interesting dynamic in the case of Libya in 2011. It was the first really good example of R2P in action. There was a resolution from the UN Security Council, as we all know, Resolution 1973, passed on the 19th of March 2011, and that resolution enabled NATO to use all necessary measures in order to fulfill a very strong mandate of protecting civilians and populated areas in eastern Libya. Now, R2P has been around for quite a long time, but this is the really first time we had a gilt-edged kind of legal backing for the hard version of R2P, which is, of course, the coercive version. And we also know, I think, that succeeded. It succeeded in actually preventing and protecting. It did succeed, I think, in preventing tens of thousands of people potentially losing their life because Gaddafi was kind of out of control at the time. But we also know it led to regime change, and this is the key interpretation of R2P that's going around in the global south, and many intellectuals in the West also support this view. Michael Ignatieff said something similar. Certainly Mark Mazower has said this. Many are actually arguing that R2P has become really a way of the Western powers engaging in regime change. So the view that R2P may now be a toxic kind of idea is very much kind of doing the rounds. And I think that's just one example of how the high point of liberalism from the West point of view is also potentially the undoing of liberalism from the point of view of the global South. One final point, which relates to R2P, and it relates to the rising power agenda. And I think it runs in two different directions. I think for the first time in a long time, rising powers have actually now wanted to say to the West that not only do they want a better share of the global order, not only do they want a seat at the table, but they want their ideas and values to matter, and they want their ideas and values to make a difference. So we're now seeing China and Russia in particular, but to some extent India, increasingly flex their muscles and not just argue about better representation, but actually how the global order might be restructured in ways that better suit their interests and better suit their conceptions of the global order. And you're really seeing a very strong sovereignty idea coming back, kind of a new sovereigntist discourse is coming back from these great powers because they prefer a global order where the West doesn't seek to actually impose or even negotiate an order that suits its own values and interests. So sovereignty has always been this kind of interesting dynamic in that it's actually a way of protecting countries from intervention from outside, but it's also a way, of course, of abusing that right and abusing that power, and this is why sovereignty plays such an ambivalent role. But we're certainly seeing in the case of Brazil and India in particular, and Russia and China, a real pushback against the idea of kind of Western global order on liberal principles, and they're saying we want to return to a much clearer, much older notion really of state sovereignty, where we decide what happens in our sovereign boundaries, we decide whether we have elections, we decide who controls our media, we decide whether human rights are accepted or whether human rights in some ways are rebalanced according to other priorities, including their own security interests. So there's a really big pushback, I think, against Western values from the rising powers, when if you actually look back 5 years ago, the rising powers are saying they wanted a voice in world politics. They wanted a seat at the table. Now they want more than that. They're actually putting comprehensive ideas and values and architecture over the global order. So I think we're starting to really see and reinforce the view that Western powers are no longer, in a sense, setting the rules of the game. I think that's been a big change in the last 1 to 2 years. Now, the last point I'll end on, which is in slight contrast to that previous point, which is that I do think that there's an argument for saying the liberal order is quite robust and the liberal order is quite resilient. And that's not because of Western sovereign states managing the global order. There's this metaphor that Eikenberry uses about steerage, the idea that you can steer a global order. And of course he sees Washington as being the place where the steering wheel and the engine and everything else is located. But I think in a way it's not about steerage necessarily. The way in which the liberal order is at its most resilient is when individuals use the internet to communicate around the world. It's when companies go and set up other companies in other parts of the world. It's when lawyers go from Washington or go from Berlin or go from Rio de Janeiro or go from parts of East and Central Africa and negotiate trading arrangements with China or trading arrangements with India. So there's a kind of inside globalization. There are multiple drivers, and they're not always being driven by the future of the global order. It's clearly not in the hands of sovereign states alone. And I do think that is an old argument from the middle 19th century, really, which is that the more peoples interact and the more trade we get, the more integrated and the more peaceful the global order. And it gets more peaceful because the costs of war rise very significantly if we really do have a dynamic and integrated global order. If you start to go to war with someone else, your currency drops, your access to the resources drops, it costs a lot of money. Think of the $2 trillion wars the United States has fought in the last decade. That really, I think, is increasingly part of an old kind of state project, this idea of interstate conflict. And what we're seeing, I think, is a lot greater resilience in the system, in part because there is too much at stake, particularly too much economic power and economic rewards are far too high to be left to the vagaries of a volatile interstate kind of order. So there is a possibility, I think, really, for the global liberal order to remain significant and remain maybe dominant, but not in the sense of Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch or the United States President deciding what's going to happen in country A or country B. It's going to be really this global public space, I think, where companies and lawyers and scientists and academics and students and all the rest of it are so embedded and so busy interacting with one another that it becomes very, very difficult for state elites to actually contemplate turning that liberal order into something else. So what I see, in short, and I hope this message has been clear, I see a real decline in the large L liberal order, and I think Eichenberry's right about that, the end of American hegemony, or at least the decline of America's predominance, and also the fact that the global human rights regime is in trouble. So those two drivers, in a sense, have question marks against them. But set against this, I think the small L liberal order is very much going to remain part of the furniture, if you like, of global politics, because it has such a strong integrative function. So I'll leave it at that, and I hope you have a good discussion. It's been nice talking to you. Bye.